Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and regimental archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Hello and welcome to episode 26 and the final part of our look at Grant's brigade of light cavalry at Waterloo. This time we're looking at the 15th Hussars. Just a reminder, we've mentioned already of the correct full titles, so this is probably the 15th King's Light Dragoons Hussars. But that's quite a mouthful, so for this episode let's just stick with the 15th Hussars. Also, at the end, I'll just run through a quick summary of the brigade, comparing some of the stats for the three regiments. So, as usual, let's begin by finding out who these men were. I've managed to find a birthplace for 313 of the 420 other ranks, so that's about 74%. And we can see here that this was another of those extremely English regiments, 293 English. So 95% of the records. 10 Scots, 4 Germans, 3 Irish, 3 Welsh. For counties, there's quite a broad mix from all over England, but we can see here that Berkshire and Hampshire tie in third place. Middlesex is second, but Wiltshire is the winner. In terms of age, there's a birth year for just 239 men, so plenty of gaps to still fill. But what we do have shows 1786 as the median year of birth, 29 years old at Waterloo. And as with the other regiments in the brigade, that relatively old soldier reflects a considerable amount of campaigning experience. There's an enlistment date for 386 of the 420 men, which is 91%, and we can see that 1807 was the median date of enlistment. So, once again, another extremely experienced regiment. I'm starting to sound like a stuck record. As we'll hear later, some of the older soldiers had fought in Flanders in the 1790s, but in terms of the Peninsular War, well, the 15th bookended it with two distinct visits. They first served in the Corunna campaign under Sir John Moore in late 1808-1809, and the regiment won glory at the cavalry skirmish at Sargun on the 21st of December 1808. Here, the 15th charged at dawn across a snow-covered plain and defeated 2 regiments of French cavalry, capturing 2 French lieutenant colonels. Several men at Waterloo carried the scars of wounds they'd received at Sargun. Over half the men of the 15th at Waterloo had been with the regiment under Sir John Moore and experienced the horrendous hardships and sorrows of that campaign. Their reward on returning to England was to spend the next couple of years chasing around the country, trying to stamp out civil unrest caused by the Luddites. But the regiment returned to the peninsula in January 1813 and saw further action, first at Vittoria, where they were heavily engaged. Again, many men at Waterloo bore the scars of that battle, and then saw further action at Orthez and finally Toulouse. 92% of the 15th at Waterloo had fought in these latter stages of the Peninsular War. One wonders just what kind of appearance a cavalry unit of such veterans had. On the basis of some of the discharge papers, it must have been quite fearsome. Private James Clark from Honiton, in Devon, for example, had received a severe wound over his left eye at Sargun, while William Nichols from the Isle of Wight had a sabre cut across his left cheek. So let's now join this seasoned lot in Flanders in 1815. The regiment was stationed in Ireland when news came of Napoleon's escape from Elba. It embarked at Cork and arrived at Ostend on the 19th of May. It was 3 squadrons strong, comprising the following 6 troops, each of around 70 other ranks. Number 1 Troop Woodhouse, Number 2 Phillips, Number 4 Booth, 5 Thackwell, 6 Whiteford and 8 Hancocks. All 6 of these troop captains were seasoned veterans of the peninsula, 5 of them even being at Corunna. The regiment was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leighton Cathcart Dalrymple, with Major Edwin Griffith second in command. On paper, the regiment comprised 22 combatant officers and 420 other ranks. In the previous 2 episodes, we've hopefully had a good look at the movements of this brigade. I don't want to repeat myself too much, so if you haven't already watched those episodes, go back and watch them first to get a full picture of the 15th's movements from the 16th to 18th June. But I'll just briefly recap. The brigade arrived at the battlefield of Quatre Bras late in the evening, long after the fighting had ended, and, exhausted from their gruelling march, lay down on the field to sleep. On the 17th of June, the retreat back to Waterloo, the brigade was split, the 15th accompanying the 13th and other regiments in a column a short distance to the west, going across country. The 7th Hussars, meanwhile, in a centre column, following the main road, and, as we heard in episode 24, were heavily engaged with the pursuing French cavalry in the streets of Genappe. At one point during the retreat, some wagons full of Allied wounded, which were lagging behind, were captured by French Hussars. A mixed force of detachments from the 13th Light Dragoons, King's German Legion, and some of Captain Woodhouse's troop of the 15th Hussars charged the enemy, and in the ensuing skirmishing, some of the captured wagons of wounded managed to make their escape back to the Allied force. Arriving at Waterloo, the 3 regiments were formed up together to the north of Hougemont and passed a terrible night in torrential rain. The regiment was mounted at 4 a.m. and remained shivering in position, getting soaked to the skin. At 10 a.m. the rains finally relented and the skies cleared. An important distinction between the 15th and the other 2 regiments of this brigade is that on the 18th of June its 3 squadrons were split up. One squadron being posted in what is described as a ravine to the west, with a further half troop being put out on picket guarding the westernmost perimeter of the Allied army. Nearby were the 51st Foot, a light infantry regiment who were old friends of the 15th Hussars. Back in Spain in June 1813, during the crossing of the river Esla, the 51st had nearly been swept to their deaths in attempting to cross a fast-flowing ford. They'd been rescued by the 15th Hussars, who dashed their horses into the water and dragged the floundering men to the riverbank, the infantrymen hanging on to their stirrups. 2 years later, in 1815, the 2 regiments passed each other on the way to Quatre Bras, the 51st giving 3 cheers, which were returned by the 15th Hussars. Now, positioned close to each other, both the 51st Foot and this detachment of the 15th suffered casualties from French cannon fire. Sergeant William Wheeler, a Bath man serving in the 51st, recalls,
"A shell now flew into the column of the 15th Hussars and burst it. I saw a sword and a scabbard fly out."
The rest of the regiment, the main force, remained with the rest of the brigade. As the whole Allied line began to come under this tremendous artillery barrage from the French batteries, the Allied guns responded. Assistant Surgeon William Gibney, still present with the regiment at this time, writes,
"So loud and continuous was this artillery duel that you could hardly hear what was said by the person next to you."
The regiment remained in position until 3 p.m. when, according to Captain Joseph Thackwell,
the 15th Hussars and 13th Light Dragoons were moved to the ravine between the Nivelles Road and Braine-l'Alleud for the purpose of attacking 10 squadrons of lancers in 2 lines, forming the left of the French army. While dispositions were being made for the attack, the lancers began cheering, and on looking towards the position we had quitted, the cause of the cheering was discovered to be an impetuous attack by the French cavalry upon our infantry and guns, the limbers of which were going rapidly towards the Nivelles Road.
Thackwell describes this French cavalry attack being driven back by the cavalry of Dernburg's King's German Legion brigade. Major General Grant, realising he'd been duped, that the Lancers were merely a feint, a successful decoy intended to draw his brigade away to the west, now cancelled the attack on the Lancers and turned back in order to support the counter-charges against the French heavy cavalry, which comprised cuirassiers and the Imperial Grenadiers à cheval. The 13th Light Dragoons led the charge, with the 15th to their left. they hit the French at around the position marked A here and drove them back to around B. Lieutenant Henry Lane of the 15th Hussars states,
"We were no sooner on our ground than we advanced in line and charged the grenadiers à cheval, who fled from us.
Both British regiments were then driven back to their own lines, where they regrouped. Thackwell stating,
Skirmishers of the 15th Hussars were employed against the cuirassiers and other cavalry to the front, who were kept at some distance.
It was during this first attack by the French heavy cavalry that a group of French cuirassiers swirling around the Allied infantry squares tried to return to their own lines down the Nivelle road, past the 15th Hussars, but came to a roadblock of broken branches and tree trunks, whereupon they were ambushed and shot down by men of the 51st Foot lining the road's steep banks. The rest of the day was spent by the 15th Hussars charging French cavalry and infantry, often being beaten back, reforming beside the Allied infantry squares, then countercharging again. Lieutenant Lane provides a good summary.
In short, during the day, we were constantly on the move, attacking and retreating to our lines, so that at the close of the battle, the two squadrons were dreadfully cut up.
Assistant Sergeant Gibney writes,
Repeated charges between the enemy's cuirassiers and our cavalry took place, in which we generally got the best of it. After a while there was a lull, each side appearing to be drawing breath before renewing the struggle.
It was perhaps in this lull that, as we heard in the previous episode, a group of officers from the 13th Light Dragoons and 15th Hussars were gathered around the brigade commander, Cahoon Grant, when a cannonball went through Grant's horse and took off Lieutenant Colonel Dalrymple's foot and ankle. Major Edwin Griffith took command of the regiment and at around 6 or 7 o'clock led the 15th in a charge on a large body of French infantry which had advanced to within less than 150 yards of the Allied line and formed in square. Lieutenant Lane again.
Our next attack was on a square of French infantry, and our horses were within a few feet of it. We did not succeed in breaking it, and of course suffered more severely.
Assistant Sergeant Gibney was present when the order came to attack these infantry.
A staff officer rode up, ordering the regiment to disperse a square of French infantry near at hand, and I was left alone in the lane to await results. These were not long in showing themselves. The carnage must have been dreadful, if I were to judge by the numbers of wounded returning to where I had remained, and that in a very short time.
Among those killed was Major Griffith, and with Captain Thackwell also wounded, command of the regiment now fell to Captain Skinner Hancocks, who led the regiment for the remainder of the day. Thackwell states that after the attack on the infantry square, another charge was made, this time against French cavalry.
Shortly after, some light cavalry and lancers, who had commoded the front of the adjoining squares of infantry, were charged and driven back.
Not long afterwards, the French began to fall back, and the broad push forward of the Allied line began. Thackwell states,
On the general advance, the regiments of the brigade made several attacks on cavalry as well as infantry.
The 15th Hussars lost 2 officers killed in action, Major Edwin Griffith and Lieutenant Isaac Sherwood. And as we'll hear in a moment, young Lieutenant Henry Buckley would shortly die of his wounds. As we've heard, Lieutenant Colonel Dalrymple lost the lower half of his leg, while Captain Thackwell suffered the amputation of his arm. Captain Whiteford was also wounded, as were 2 brothers, Lieutenants Edward and William Byam. 25 other ranks were killed or died of wounds, and 43 men wounded. We can see here casualty figures for the 6 troops. I've put my figures in black. These are my totals from various musters, casualty ledgers and discharge papers at the Public Record Office. And this time it's the Regimental History's official figures in brackets in red. They're reassuringly similar. The only real difference is that the official stats list another 7 men wounded. And this discrepancy is to be expected. The sources available to a researcher are piecemeal and incomplete. It's worth considering probably that such a figure, an extra 15% or so, should very possibly be added to all my figures for wounded across this series. There's no doubt at all that there were wounded men in every regiment, for whom no written record survives. The regimental records contain a document which lists the following breakdown of the regiment at Waterloo. It adds the comment, "It will be noticed how few were the casualties in the right troops detached all day to the west of the position, and that the losses were sustained mainly by the remainder of the regiment." And that line helps us to identify which troops were stationed to the right and which troops were part of the main force. We'll talk about that in a moment. I have to say, I find these numbers fascinating because they reveal just how many Waterloo men were not actually present in the battle. Almost a third of the sergeants, for example, were in the rear, and in total 14% of the other ranks were not in action. Furthermore, it shows that most of the fighting, all those counter-charges throughout the afternoon and evening, were carried out by around just half of the regiment's total other ranks, 239 men. The numbers of the detached force on the right are a bit perplexing. Thackwell states 1 squadron and a division, in other words 2.5 troops. Over a third of the regiment was posted to the right. And the ratio of privates supports that, 239 in the main force, 125 detached on the right. But the number of NCOs and trumpeters suggests an equal split. It's unclear why the number of NCOs is almost the same. Anyway, sorry, this might not be the most scintillating stuff, so I'll stop there. But I do find it all very intriguing. And increasingly, in terms of numbers of men present and so on, I find the more information I gather, the less I feel I can claim with any great confidence. Among the wounded was Lieutenant Henry Buckley, aged just 18. Assistant Surgeon Gibney writes,
I came across my dear young friend, Lieutenant Buckley of my regiment. He had received a bullet wound in his stomach. The missile had passed through his liver and come out his back, causing great hemorrhage. I hurriedly dressed the wound and gave him all the hopes possible, but did not conceal my misgivings. It was a melancholy sight to find a youth of his age, perhaps 19 or 20, cut off in the very opening of life, and this his first battle.
Buckley died the following day. Of the 43 wounded other ranks, 13 would be discharged with a pension due to their wounds. These included Privates Robert Soper from Twickenham and George Knight from Wells in Somerset, who both had one of their arms amputated. Let's now look at each of the 6 troops in detail. Number 1 troop, Wodehouse, or is it Woodhouse? I don't know. This was the troop which was involved in skirmishing on the 17th of June around the wagons of Allied wounded. At Waterloo, with just 1 man killed, Private George Black from East Lothian, and 1 man died of wounds, Samuel Morgan from Amersham in Buckinghamshire, I would assume this was part of the squadron posted to the west at Waterloo. It contained the regiment's newest recruit, Private John Andrews from Newbury in Berkshire, who'd enlisted in only February 1815. Perhaps not being a peninsular man, it was hard to fit in, but he never seems to have taken to the military life, deserting first in October 1816, then again in 1818 while at Coventry. 2 strikes often meant out, and he was branded with the letter D for deserter below the armpit and sent to general service, which was usually a penal unit. Number 2 troop, Phillips. I suggested in the last episode that McAllister's troop of the 13th Light Dragoons might be unique in the British Army at Waterloo for suffering no fatalities. Well, it didn't take long to disprove that foolish conjecture. This troop, B Troop of the 15th Hussars, not only suffered no fatalities, but had only 1 man wounded, Private Thomas Beckington from Great Bedwin, Wiltshire. So we can assume that this was the other troop of the detached squadron posted to the west. It was commanded by Captain Frederick Phillips. He was the nephew of Major Griffiths, who was killed at the battle. He was the youngest of the 6 captains commanding troops, being just 25 years old. We've heard several times before of men going into battle at Waterloo, their backs still bandaged from the fresh wounds of a flogging, and we'll doubtless hear of many more in future. Private Thomas Carter of this troop was one such unfortunate. He'd been absent from morning roll call just a week before Waterloo, was sentenced to 200 lashes, and on the 12th of June, just 6 days before the battle, had received 100 of them, the rest being remitted. Number 4 Troop. This troop was commanded by Captain William Booth from Bayton in Yorkshire, aged 30 in 1815. The troop contained 2 Germans, Sergeant John Winterfeld and trumpeter Augustus Nesler. Intriguingly, both men would later desert. Indeed, this troop seemed to be a motley bunch of rogues, albeit fairly harmless ones. For some reason, a disproportionate number of court-martials befell the men of Number 4 Troop, and we'll hear of some of these later. Number 5 Troop, Thackwells. Captain Joseph Thackwell received a wound in the left arm, which later caused it to be amputated close to the shoulder. He survived, and again we'll return to him later. Troops 5 and 6 suffered the worst casualties, and were in the thick of the fighting, presumably losing most of their men in the attack on the French infantry square. The 5 men killed in action were Sergeant Munro from Lambeth, and Privates William Milton from Teddington, Henry Townsend from Shelton, Wiltshire, John Carnell from Sandy Acre, Derbyshire, Henry Curtis from Highmore, Oxfordshire, and Joseph French from Curry Rival in Somerset. Number 6 Troop, Whitefords. So this was the other troop that was most hit hard, with 7 men killed. A look at the enlistment dates of this troop shows what a bunch of grizzled veterans they must have been. 31 men, over half the troop, fighting across Spain in the dreadful retreat to Corunna in 1808-1809. The troop's Sergeant Major, Daniel Hurd, was an old veteran even in 1808, having served in the Flanders campaign of 1793 to 1795, and then again at the Helder in 1799. He would have been 41 years old at Waterloo. And finally, Number 8 Troop, Hancock's troop. As we heard earlier, Captain Skinner Hancock took command of the regiment, all the officers senior to him being killed or wounded. He was 30 years old. This troop's Sergeant Major, George Chettle from Leicester, rose to be commissioned, being appointed the regiment's quartermaster in 1824. The previous year he'd married a Catherine Greasley at Kensington. This was presumably a sister or daughter of William Greasley, who was the troop sergeant major of Thackwell's troop. Sgt Thomas Newell of this troop, from Henley in Oxfordshire, received this wound in his right leg, as sketched by a surgeon at Brussels, whose notes simply state,
"Tibia and fibula shattered by grape shot. Doing well."
Sergeant Newell survived the wound, but it did lead to his discharge in 1817. On Christmas Day 1828, aged 42, he became an inn-pensioner at Chelsea Hospital. After Waterloo, the regiment formed part of the Army of Occupation, being quartered around Lyon-la-Fleurette, about 60 miles northwest of Paris. A good time seems to have been had by all. Corporal Edward Bailey from Bishop's Frome, Herefordshire, was court-martialled a few weeks after Waterloo
for highly irregular and disgraceful conduct on the night of the 29th June and the morning of the 30th, when Corporal of the Guard, in allowing improper persons, inhabitants of the town, to enter and remain in the guard room, for suffering great irregularity in the guard room, and for being drunk on duty at the aforementioned period.
Corporal Bailey was reduced back to private and sentenced to 100 lashes, although these were forgiven, we can assume, for his previous good character. The regiment's stay in northern France was brief, and in May 1816 it returned to England, where it was needed to suppress increasing social unrest, being posted to Nottingham, Birmingham and Wolverhampton. In October 1816, serious rioting at Birmingham led to several rioters being wounded by the 15th Hussars, while now Major Thackwell was hit on the head and knocked unconscious by a stone thrown from the crowd. As we've heard in several previous episodes about cavalry regiments, Britain was not a happy nation in the years following Waterloo. The unemployment caused by the Industrial Revolution's mechanisation of traditional cottage industries, accompanied by rising food prices, led to increasingly angry calls for social change. Despite the whole nation teetering on the verge of revolution, it's often quite difficult to find any record of what occurred, the British newspapers of the day deliberately not reporting much of the unrest, and so the great majority of the protest and rioting spreading across the land at this time is now long forgotten. But 3 instances of protest and uprising did gain sufficient levels of infamy to still be well known today. And it just so happened that the 15th Hussars played a part in all 3. First, we've heard already of the 15th being sent to suppress the Luddite movement back in 1811 and 1812. But after the war, the regiment was embroiled in both the Pentrick uprising in Derbyshire in 1817 and then the Peterloo massacre 2 summers later in 1819. It would take too long to go through these last 2 events in detail here, but perhaps sometime in the future we can do an episode on what happened and look at which Waterloo men were present and how they were involved. But for now, a very potted history. The Pentrick uprising took place in June 1817 in Derbyshire, led by a Nottinghamshire man named Jeremiah Brandreth. With the help of the 15th Hussars, the uprising was suppressed. 35 people were put on trial, and Brandreth and 2 other leaders were found guilty of high treason and sentenced to receive the medieval punishment of being hung, drawn and quartered. Even for George, the Prince Regent, this was a bit much, and he commuted the drawing and quartering part of the sentence. But still, after being hanged, the 3 men were then beheaded with an axe, and were the last unfortunates to suffer this fate in Britain. The second, even more infamous incident was the Peterloo massacre. At this time, only 11% of adult males had the right to vote, and a meeting of over 60,000 people gathered in St. Peter's Field, Manchester, as part of a countrywide movement for wider suffrage. The crowd was charged first by the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, a volunteer regiment of cavalry led by factory owners. Then they were charged by the 15th Hussars. 18 people were killed and many hundreds wounded and injured. Without wishing to whitewash the regiment's role that day, it's worth mentioning that many sources point to the worst excesses of violence committed on the crowd coming from the Manchester Yeomanry, rather than by the Hussars. Something to discuss another day, but as I've said already in previous episodes, one can only wonder what the ordinary soldiers felt. Lauded heroes of the nation one moment, then despised butchers the next. It's probably not unrelated that within a few years of this widespread social upheaval, the first police forces were formed. It would have surely become apparent that soldiers were not necessarily the best suited to oversee law enforcement. Throughout these years of the regiment moving around the country to supposedly bring order, there were numerous court-martials of Waterloo men for behaviour that was actually quite the reverse. Here are some examples. In 1817 at Birmingham, the court-martial of Private Joshua Dixon.
Highly irregular and disorderly conduct when on the march from Tamworth on Saturday last, in stopping at a public house on the road to drink and arriving at headquarters at a late hour in a state of intoxication, without his sword and part of his appointments.
And Private Edward Shirley.
For very disgraceful and nefarious conduct, at diverse times, but particularly on the night of Tuesday last, the 7th, when he purloined from the Hen and Chicken Hotel in Birmingham, where he was billeted, some coal, the property of Mr. William Waddell, the landlord. Found partly guilty and sentenced to 2 months solitary confinement, did 8 days in town jail, and then released and allowed to spend the remainder of the sentence in the barracks with the log.
Presumably, the log was rather like a ball and chain. Wherever poor Edward Shirley went, he had to carry a heavy log of wood with him. 1818 at Norwich, William Machin, also of No. 4 Troop.
For absenting himself from his quarters at Norwich Barracks without leave after roll call on Saturday night, the 24th of October, 1818, and remaining absent until the following morning. Such conduct in a non-commissioned officer being highly irregular and subversive of good order and military discipline, as tending to set a bad example to the private soldiers of the regiment.
Later that year at Bury St Edmunds, Private Joseph Turner from Stockport was court-martialed
for most disgraceful conduct at Bury St Edmunds on or about the 14th day of October 1818 in stealing or otherwise improperly obtaining a silk handkerchief of Sergeant John Sopwell of Brevet Major Hancock's troop, and for stealing from the premises of Mr. John Coxsedge publican of Bury St Edmunds, at whose house the prisoner was quartered, a quantity of wine amounting in all to 16 bottles, or thereabouts, the property of Mr. Moore Esquire, and in the care of John Batson, bookkeeper to the Cambridge Waggon Office.
So what became of the Waterloo men of the 15th? Well, as you're doubtless already aware if you've listened to previous episodes, the years 1817, 1819, 1821 saw a series of huge cuts to all regiments, and many men of the 15th were discharged in those reductions. As ever, it was an opportunity to weed out the elderly and sickly, as well as the lazy and unreliable. One thing we haven't really talked about much in this series is the soldiers' height. Not at least since the first few episodes, when we learnt how remarkably tall the men of the Life Guards and Royal Horse Guards were, many being 6 foot and above, this being almost freakishly tall for the age. Few men in the Light Dragoons and Hussars were taller than 5'9", and the average was probably 5'7". During the reductions, several men of the 15th who were 5'6" and below were discharged for being undersized. It seems hardly fair. Many a brave man who was deemed perfectly big enough to charge the French cavalry at Sargun and Vittoria, and the heavy French cavalry at Waterloo, were now considered too small to charge the crowds of civilians at St. Peter's Field and the like. Of course, when the army had no further use for its cavalrymen, so their horses also became surplus to requirement. As you can see here, 43 horses of the King's Hussars for sale at Norwich. Some of the regiment's officers rose high in the army. Joseph Thackwell survived his arm being amputated at Waterloo and being knocked out by a brick at Birmingham, and ended up a major general, commanding the cavalry in India. He was a major figure in the colonial wars, and can be marked down as one of those individuals for whom a whole episode is probably needed to cover his extraordinary life in sufficient depth. Lieutenant William Bellairs was from a very military family. His brother Henry was a midshipman at Trafalgar and was twice wounded, while William's son distinguished himself at Inkerman in the Crimean War, then later fought against the Xhosa and Zulus in South Africa, rising to be a lieutenant general in 1887. And the son of Assistant Surgeon William Gibney, Robert, was also to experience high adventure in the Empire, serving as an officer in the 59th Bengal Native Infantry, where he was caught up in the Great Indian Mutiny of 1857, and later wrote an account, My Escape from the Mutinies in Oudh by a Wounded Officer. The last Waterloo man of the regiment still serving in its ranks was Private Thomas Hazelhurst, a Sheffield man in No. 4 Troop at Waterloo. He was discharged in September 1839, aged 45, after 27 years in the regiment. And who were the last surviving Waterloo men of the 15th Hussars? From the officers, it was our old friend Assistant Surgeon William Gibney. He retired from the army on half pay in 1818 and set up in private practice in Cheltenham. He died at Bath in 1872, aged 78. From the other ranks, the last survivor was probably Samuel Windsor from Tenterden in Kent. Enlisting in 1808, he'd been present on the Corunna campaign, and then later Vittoria and Toulouse, at one of which he was cut on the head by a French sabre. No angel, he'd been court-martialed in late 1816 for being sent on an errand to take a letter from Newark to Nottingham. He'd arrived in what was described as an extreme state of intoxication, having not only lost the letter, but also his horse. For this he was sentenced to 300 lashes and received 299. Nice to have let him off that last one. He was discharged the following year without a pension and gained employment back at his native Tenterden, working for many years as a servant, before in old age being dependent on parish relief. He spent his final years earning a pittance as a butcher's assistant, and died in 1880, aged 95. Now before we finish, let's just have a quick summary of the whole of Grant's brigade and compare some of the data for the three regiments. So to recap, in terms of nationality, while the 13th Light Dragoons had a large Irish contingent, The Hussars were predominantly English. Middlesex, Monaghan and Wiltshire were the counties which contained the most men for each of those three regiments. The men of all three at Waterloo tended to be relatively old, with a median age of 28, 32 and 29. There were corresponding mean enlistment dates of 1809, 1804 and 1807. And just to repeat, many of the older men would have also served in the Fencible cavalry in the 1790s. In terms of men killed or died of wounds at Waterloo, over the 2 days fighting, the three regiments suffered similar casualty rates. But for the number of wounded, the 7th were significantly more cut up. It's interesting, and we've talked about this in the Household Brigade episodes, it seems to suggest that lance wounds were far less frequently fatal than those received from sabres and musket and cannonballs. Twice as many men of the 7th Hussars wounded as the 15th, but the same number of fatalities, as most of their wounds came from combat at Genappe with lancers. And finally, you can see the number of men pensioned due to their wounds here. So that brings us to the end of this episode on the 15th Hussars, and also on this 3-part series on Grant's Brigade. I hope you found it interesting. Do please click subscribe if so. Many thanks to those of you who've already done so, and thank you also for all the kind comments and emails that keep me going. Thanks, as always, to the fantastic kind volunteers who add so much to these episodes, and particularly great to have some of these read by current or ex-members of the 15th Hussars descendant regiments. Robert Polley, Smudge Smith and Liam Young. Next time we'll be looking at another troop of the Royal Horse Artillery, this time Ramsay's troop, so I hope you'll join me for that. And until then, many thanks for watching.